Jack Smith wants the Supremes to stop Trump's legal appeals. Trump, those pesky legal appeals, saying he shouldn't even be prosecuted anyway. Jack Smith is alleging that Donald Trump tried to steal the election. And now he wants to force some of the back and forth to go right up to the United States Supreme Court. The court has in turn asked Donald Trump's lawyers to send a response to all of this by next week so they can take a closer look at it. Let's get into the details of what was really going on here and what it really all means with Joe Digenova now. He's a legal analyst and former U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia. Sir, as always, good to have you. Thank you.
Great to be with you, Vince.
All right, so Jack Smith wants to skip the pesky appeals process. Why?
Because he wants to have his trial before the election and get a conviction and get a sentence and get the president somehow disqualified, tie him up in court. It's patently obvious what's going on here, and while it's not embarrassing to the Department of Justice, it should be.
How unusual is it for an attorney, a federal attorney, to skip all of the appeals courts and go right to the Supreme Court with a petition like this?
It's extremely unusual, notwithstanding what you've heard some commentators say on television. It's very unusual. It does happen from time to time in rare cases. I think it happened in the Pentagon Papers case, actually. But that was 50 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's not an everyday occurrence. So it's unusual. And in this case, it's unjustified. There's no reason to have this case heard quickly, except to have it affect the election.
So as I understand it, the case that Trump is making is that he's entitled to immunity for a number of reasons. One of them was that he was president of the United States at the time of the behavior in question, and he was merely exercising the powers of the office. And additionally, that this places Trump in a bit of double jeopardy, considering the constitutional remedy to a dispute like this is impeachment. It already was conducted. The Senate acquitted him. So a legal process in the courts is improper and unconstitutional. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's what he's arguing. I don't think the argument about impeachment is a good one. Impeachment is a political process with regard to your right to remain in office. It doesn't have anything to do with the criminal justice system. It doesn't affect double jeopardy under the Fifth Amendment. But the president does have good arguments, that he can make about his immunity. And so far that hasn't worked in any court in the United States. His arguments about that have been rejected everywhere. So have his efforts to remove state cases to federal court. Whether or not the Supreme Court would be more solicitous of his view, I simply don't know. The court's written very little about this, and maybe that's why they wanted to hear from the president to see whether or not they should expedite the appeal process, although I think, again, I can't see any reason to expedite anything.
Is it possible that this ends in a way that benefits Trump? In other words, the Supreme Court says, okay, yes, we'll expedite this process, and then by the end of it, they render a judgment that actually, yes, Trump is entitled to immunity here.
Well, that could happen, and that would be quite a victory for the president, the former president.
Yeah.
But nobody knows the answer to that question, whether or not they would do that.
Okay.
Even with a conservative court, it isn't clear whether or not the president's arguments about his immunity. He clearly was president of the United States when all of this happened, and there isn't any doubt about that. The question is whether or not he was exercising functions of the presidency when this occurred. Nobody doubts that if he had murdered someone, that wouldn't be covered by immunity at any point in time.
Sure. Okay, so then there's the question of the election interference that we started with. The Justice Department in the past has made a big deal out of, we don't want to interfere in elections. In fact, we have a policy against it, not to have any criminal proceeding that could jeopardize the ability for the American people to render a judgment. So we don't want to be involved in play in elections here. Isn't this Jack Smith straight up saying that actually the point of the Justice Department is to interfere in elections, and we're trying to accelerate this to make sure it happens during the election?
Of course, that's exactly what's going on here. There is no reason to accelerate the trial schedule in any of these trials. They can all wait till after the election.
Yes.
But he doesn't want that. Jack Smith, wants to affect the outcome he knows he's going to get a conviction in the District of Columbia if they go to trial. There's just no doubt about it. He's going to get a conviction. This jury pool is completely prejudiced against the President of the United States. And no matter what Judge Chutkan says, poo-pooing the concerns of the defense about the ability of the president to get a fair trial, there is no way that President Trump can get a fair trial in the District of Columbia. And so Jack Smith knows that.
Yes.
He knows he's going to get a conviction, and he wants it to happen before the election.
You know, perhaps one of the reasons, other than meddling in the election explicitly, that Jack Smith is motivated for this is because he thinks, well, there's no chance of getting a conviction if Trump wins, because he could just instruct the attorney general to stop the prosecution, or he could just issue himself a pardon and move on. In other words, Jack Smith would be angry that the American people would render a judgment before he has a chance to.
Sure. Well, he certainly doesn't want the American people electing Donald Trump president, because Trump would have the power to pardon himself. There's no law on that, but there's no law that says he can't, and
right.
The pardon power is not circumscribed in the Constitution. There's no language that limits it. So, yeah, clearly, I mean, he wants his pound of flesh, because even if Trump wins the election and does eventually pardon himself, let's theoretically say that,
yeah,
Smith can then say, hey, I convicted him. He was guilty. The American people, in terms of the jury in the District of Columbia, spoke. And yet the American people then elected him president of the United States. What's the value of that conviction? I don't know. I mean, who knows? It wouldn't be worth very much if Trump became president and pardoned himself.
And it is possible for Trump to tell the attorney general to just knock it off, correct? If he becomes president again.
Oh, sure. He could do what Bill Barr did in the case of the General Flynn prosecution, which is order the case dismissed. In that case, it was over the objection of the trial judge, who did everything he could to delay dismissing the case until it became fairly obvious that if he didn't, there were going to be some serious consequences for the trial judge. Emmett Sullivan was his name.
Right. Because I know there's often this big thing about, the president is separate and distinct from the Justice Department, shouldn't be involved in the affairs of the Justice Department, which is a funny thing to say, because, remember when Joe Biden took office after that, there were some people who were fighting congressional subpoenas from the January 6th committee, which was improperly composed in the first place. And right. Joe Biden straight up told the press they should be prosecuted. He wanted the Justice Department to prosecute them for contempt of Congress for not responding to these ridiculous subpoenas. Now, of course, you're watching the same scenario play out this week for Hunter Biden. And, well, Joe can't talk about it. You see, it's the Justice Department is totally independent.
Well, the president has influenced the Justice Department by his public statements and by his various intimations about his son, by simply saying that his son did nothing wrong. He was influencing the Justice Department and sending a clear message, which they heard at the Justice Department. You know from the evidence of what happened in Delaware from the IRS whistleblowers that the assistant U.S. attorney and the U.S. attorney up in Delaware purposely avoided questions about the Biden family, no search warrants for the Biden facilities. So it was clear that the Biden desires to leave the family alone were heeded all along the way.
Yes.
And, of course, the only reason this blew up was because the trial judge in Delaware blew up the plea agreement, and then we ended up with this fake case being filed against Hunter Biden in California, which, lo and behold, manages to avoid any charges which would implicate the sitting president, Joe Biden.
Yeah, and I may get a chance to return to the Hunter Biden story with you in a moment, but I have one more question for you on Jack Smith. We see that he intends to use Trump's cell phone data at trial. The cell phone that Trump was using while he was president of the United States. Jack Smith has apparently raided it and extracted and pulled out a bunch of the data from his cell phone that he intends to use as an exhibit at trial. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here. My impression was that Trump is entitled, as president of the United States, to executive privilege, and that would include the contents and conversations on his cell phone, wouldn't it?
Sure would.
So is Jack Smith doing something unconstitutional here?
No, because I assume that he got permission from Judge Beryl Howell, who was the former chief judge of the United States District Court in D.C., to do that and to get those things. And as you know, Beryl Howell is the one who created the situation where she found a crime fraud exception to the attorney-client privilege and allowed all of Trump's lawyers to be forced to give up notes and go in the grand jury and testify against their client, or at least testify about their client, maybe not against their client. I'm sure Beryl Howell blessed this seizure and said that it wasn't privileged with any privilege. I think Judge Howell has proven herself to be no friend of the Constitution and certainly no friend of any criminal defendant. Her performance in this case, along with most of the judges on the U.S. District Court here, has been an embarrassment.
It's amazing what we're witnessing. Back to the Hunter Biden story now with you. You do see this indictment come out this past week indicating that
yes.
that Hunter Biden has been hit with 9 tax-related charges for failing to pay millions of dollars in taxes. And he classified a bunch of obviously personal and many sexual expenses as if they were business expenses. And, of course, they weren't. Any fair reading of the indictment demonstrates that that wasn't for business at all. So that's interesting. But what's also interesting is whose name is not mentioned. You mentioned this a moment ago. Joe Biden doesn't come up in this. We aren't seeing any Foreign Agent Registration Act violations, any charges to that effect. And also, I thought it was kind of curious that the man who's been giving Hunter Biden so much of the money, Kevin Morris, to pay off all of his debts, is described throughout the indictment as a, quote, personal friend. Like the Justice Department is actually straight up buying the Biden family's explanation for this, rather than treating him as a campaign donor who's giving in-kind contributions to the Bidens.
Well, I think that the entire case against Hunter Biden is a farce. The indictment in California is something that David Weiss was forced to do because he was embarrassed into this position by the IRS whistleblower disclosures on Capitol Hill. Those men are heroes. They are worthy of all kinds of awards and kudos, and they deserve the financial support of the American people. They should give to them and send them money and help them out. It's pretty obvious that this guy, David Weiss, is a corrupt United States attorney. He's not doing anything for the right reason. His performance has been embarrassment to anyone who's ever been a United States attorney. His judgment has been completely political. It's hard for me to talk about this and not kind of violate the FCC code by talking about him, because he's such a disgrace. And this indictment in California is a nothing burger. It doesn't mention Farah. It does, because that would involve the president. It doesn't mention bribery, because that would involve the president. It doesn't mention a conspiracy, because that would involve the president plus other members of the family. It is a joke. It's a fill-in-the-blanks indictment that he could have returned 5 years ago. Instead, it's 5 years late, and he missed all the really good tax years, 2014, 2015, because all of those involved the president of the United States. So when you look at this and you see how transparently political the decisions are and how corrupt the decision-making has been in D.C., Delaware, I mean, U.S. Attorney in D.C., Matthew Graves, would not partner with Mr. Weiss when he wanted to bring cases in D.C. Isn't that a shame? Mr. Graves didn't want to partner. Now, I thought Mr. Graves loved to partner with people. He looks like he's just kind of partnering kind of guy when you take a look at him. He shows up. Actually, he doesn't show up at many news conferences. I think that's because he's so embarrassed by his performance as United States Attorney for the District of Columbia. I mean, the crime spree in this city that's going on right now is the direct result of incompetent law enforcement by the Metropolitan Police Department and the United States Attorney's Office and the D.C. City Council that loves crime and loves criminals.
Well, Matt Graves, what was it, yesterday? He did a presser where he claims he's going to get tough on carjackers now, which is funny because it happens right after an FBI agent got carjacked. And suddenly the feds care, you know?
Well, why hasn't he been tough up until now? Carjacking is bad no matter who it happens to or when it happens or how many times. And all you have to do is talk to somebody who's been the victim of it and had a 45 stuffed in their face and had their car taken away from them.
Well, I tell you, if Hunter Biden was carjacked, they'd be all over it in an instant.
He is a victim. He is a victim.
He is the victim of this story, of course. Joe Digenova, thank you very much, former U.S. Attorney and my friend. Good to talk to you, sir, as always.
You bet, Vince. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you. It's 3:50 now.